TV, powered by Communitech. From Waterloo region in Ontario, Canada to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear with interesting people on topics at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Thank you, Talia. That was fantastic. And welcome everyone to True North TV. Great to have you here today. We've got a very special guest with us today. It's John Seely Brown, and I'm not freaking kidding. It's John freaking Seely Brown, and he's decided to come on with us and spend some time with us. And you know, like, he's done a bit of everything. He's now been running the Center at the Edge, which is a Deloitte's initiative for a bunch of years. He's a scholar at USC. But perhaps he's best known sort of out there in the role that he played as chief scientist at Xerox Corp, where he was served as the director of this famed Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC. And PARC, yeah, it like invented things like the computer, and the personal computer anyway, and the mouse, and what's called GUI, which, you know, anybody who's not 50 or older doesn't remember what GUI was. But before we had GUI, the interface with the computer was pretty freaking ugly. So, and the laser printer and the Ethernet and a few other things. And I think that what's really interesting about John and why we wanted to have him on the show is that, you know, he's always been a bit of an oddball. You know, he's not just a scientist. He's not just a computer geek. He's always been focused on the social side, people, human beings, and in a way, you know, the essence of what True North is all about, which is what happens at the intersection between technology and humanity. Now he calls himself the chief of confusion, which I love because I think anybody who's absolute or certain about anything at this point in time in COVID world probably shouldn't be trusted. So without further ado, John, thank you for making time to chat with us today.
Greetings.
It's great to have you here. Now, I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions. Gosh, why was it so important to you that Xerox PARC take a broader perspective on tech and innovation? Because I think at the time, you know, it was very much about the tech and cool gadgets and stuff like that.
Yeah, it absolutely was about the tech. That's all people talked about. But somehow people forgot something. Tech is actually used by people, real people, doing real stuff. And maybe, just maybe, it would help in designing more useful technology to better understand how real people really work, and how they learn and how they interact with each other and so on and so forth. So it seemed kind of interesting to think about how do people actually improvise, or in fact, technology never works perfectly. How do you kind of cope with the foibles that you always discover? You know, and in fact, we tend to believe that so much of work is stylized in terms of rote work. But in fact, even often the most rote work is the furthest thing from being rote. You know, if you look at how call centers actually work, you know, the way we thought call centers worked, we actually put serious anthropologists in there to study what goes on. It turns out that the call centers, people are constantly handling the unexpected question. In fact, I come to think that the only thing to be expected is the unexpected. And so how do we really cope with that? How do we feel comfortable with that? How do we use that? And how do we actually help each other working around us? So if you see what we do with call centers, we now make them little squads. And how in the squad are they learning from each other, watching each other, overhearing each other, and everything like this? And so it seemed like what we really need to do is to craft a new kind of partnership between us and the technology. Us as the people using it, and the wonderful technology that we as designers thought was perfect, but in fact always felt a little bit short of handling the unusual.
Now, Tim Berners-Lee, who we had on True North last year, you know, he feels to some extent that his baby the World Wide Web, is turned out to be Frankenstein. And he's very concerned about the web and what's been built on it in a whole bunch of different ways. Be interested in knowing your thoughts on that, or if there's something that you were involved with that you just didn't turn out the way you'd hoped for, and that it wasn't the sort of miraculous promise that technology, was all about in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Well, I think that Tim is being gentle in some of his comments. Those of us in the 70s and 80s had the most romantic view of what technology could do to bring us together, to actually democratize the world, and to let us kind of participate as human beings in constantly evolving ways. And in fact, the idea of even Google, it seemed like, as powerful as Wikipedia in terms of helping me discover things on the fly, amplifying my curiosity. That was the holy grail, okay? And pretty soon we kind of say, there's been some non-obvious uses of that, and so on and so forth. Let me take a simple little example. In a curious sort of way, some of the very first things we did many, many decades ago was built spelling correction. Okay, well, it's very interesting that you wanted the spelling correction system to be able to second guess you perfectly. And the better we made it, the less you checked. And again, last night I sent out a message, and the goddamn spelling corrector completely transformed the meaning of this sentence by correcting a word into the opposite of the word I was thinking about. But I had lost the patience to kind of carefully read what it had done. And so we kind of count on technology to do things that turn out to be second guessing us, often wrong, or compromising what we really are about, or extracting incredible things out of us in order to, quote unquote, make it easier for us. And so I have no notion of what I have given up in order to be able to have, for example, Google second guess what my real question is when I do a search, and so on. And so there's a whole sense that we as technologists had an overly romantic view of how technology would be in service of us. And we tended to downplay kind of an economic model that was constantly extracting value from us in ways we never understood in order to make it free for us to use. And so we kind of entered into a world of being willing to give up any sense of privacy in order to make our lives supposedly easier. And that was kind of the beginning of a major shift that has now taken us into Cambridge Analytica and things like that. So, I think that we've lost track of the romanticism that so many of us had in the early days, where we could only see the value of building a community and never thought about kind of the downside of what that might actually mean when that got out of control, and so on and so forth. So I think that we had underplayed new kinds of commercial models that have taken over, and yet so many of us, like myself, I would just prefer to say, okay, I don't want to see any damn ads. I don't want to give up anything. I'm willing to pay. And so, in a funny sort of way, we've always been caught between, you want it free or you want to pay? And of course, that decision isn't giving us anymore. So, it's been an interesting evolution. where we've completely misunderstood the social mind as opposed to the individual mind.
It's interesting. With all that we've seen about digital addiction in the last while, and a real understanding, or as my friend Marcel O'Gorman would say, it's digital dependency. But is there a way we can kind of fight back to a place of maybe not utopia where we romanticize the wonder and power that technology and how it's going to change our lives? Is there a way we can take back the night? Is there a way that we can take back control? I go back to Tim Berners-Lee and what he's trying to do. What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I have two simple responses to that, in a way. The first is this amazing digital world we have entered, or information world we have entered. We now have unlimited ability to amplify and to exercise curiosity. So it's now possible in a moment's notice to look anything up. Anytime I'm reading and now I see a word I don't know, bang, I can get its full definition, or I can go to Wikipedia and get an expanded definition, and so on. And so basically, a desire, having a good curiosity and a desire to learn says now almost anything I do provides an opportunity to open my aperture a little bit to learn something new. And so I think that there's a spirit of how do I approach today's changing world as an opportunity to constantly be learning new things or refining insights and so on, okay? And so if you don't have an innate curiosity, then we got a problem. Now here, I'm gonna be a little bit radical in saying, if you look back when we are up to about 7 or 8 years old, we have insatiable curiosity. Just look at a kid up to 7, 8 years old. They're constantly playing with things. They're constantly pushing things around. They're constantly, probing stuff. And what happens? They go to school, and that sense of play, that sense of exploration, that sense of curiosity is actually knocked out of them in order to push toward learning standard material. They memorize this material. And in fact, each of us learned to stop asking questions. Because, you go into a class, especially science classes, meaning early science classes, you're just filled with, why is that? Why is that? Why that? You ask a teacher, why 6 times in a row, and you suddenly get sent to the back of the class, and yet it's the ability to constantly ask why that we now have at our fingertips. But have we lost the desire or the skill to do that? So, I like to think about, and we all have the problem of something called fake news. One of the things I find strange is if you learn how to interrogate context as opposed to just content, you learn how to triangulate on situations. You start asking multiple questions to yourself. Why is it that? Why is it that? What about if it had been this instead? And so on. How do I look at it from this angle? How do I look at it from this angle? And so on. And so it's kind of like playing with the context that you begin to get a sense, do I want to believe it or not? And now we have an ability to reach out and grab more of the contextual settings of things, look at them from multiple points of view, or to pull a couple people in and say, let's have a conversation about this. There's a certain sense of saying, content is now been, has lost some of its meaning. I mean, it's interesting. I obviously, having written the book, The Social Life of Information, with my good colleague Paul Duguid, guess what? The cover of the book tells you a hell of a lot. Guess what? I can open the book and I can feel the weight of the paper. The weight of the paper tells me something. The quality of the print tells me something. The physical artifact tells me something. What does it afford? What are the affordances of this thing? Okay, which, by the way, we've lost in some of the electronic world, which says we got to come back and figure out how do we amplify the resources that we typically use in order to triangulate on context, I might point out, and so on. So, I mean, I think that we haven't paid enough attention to the resources we latently and subconsciously use to make sense out of things. And we now have to be able to, think deeply about the network affordances to help to make up for some of those resources that we've lost as we've gone to radical digitalization. Now that's obvious at the simple world of paper, the book, the document, and so on and so forth. I'm saying it goes all the way out to political discourse. And so you see that if you keep viewing these things as just isolated objects, that are rendered on your screen, you're already taking things so far out of the native world. But we as the technologists and even we as designers tend to overlook what seems so innate in things. And so, again, going back to some of your opening questions, taking a more anthropological point of view, you begin to see the texture in things in new ways and realize we're using these things as signals, but not consciously. They're part of our peripheral vision. And, I'm really struck, I'm a fanatic of motorcyclists, having driven most of the world on motorcycles. You forget that it's your peripheral vision that keeps you alive. Streaming down one of the roads that I drive way too fast on, it's my peripheral vision that notices some twigs just moved in the field. And suddenly it alerts my brain to shift my cognitive attention to that. Is it an animal that's about to run out in front of me? And so in fact, we as human processes use peripheral and center and interesting balances between them, but we as designers don't know how to take advantage of peripheral vision.
You've had a front row seat to Silicon Valley, and I got a couple questions in there. I think you mentioned when we were chatting before the show, you were, 2 blocks or something away from Bill Gates' garage, as I recall.
Bill Hewlett.
Bill
HP.
Hewlett.
Yeah.
Yes, the famous garage. So front row seat to all this stuff. And you've seen the likes of Bill Gates build up an incredible company. And I think someone who really is committed to using his resources and his wealth to make, the world a better place. And then you got douchey Zuckerberg. Like, what is it about? Is it a generational thing, or is it just, there's a sense of entitlement or tone deafness to, the way that these people view the world? Do you think there was more of a social contract and commitment with some of the founders such as Hewlett and Packard and Bill Gates and those that, as opposed to the ones that exist now?
Well, I think one has to be careful in how one looks at this. I think the hype in Silicon Valley tends to pull you to look at the world through what I'm going to call tunnel vision, and see it only one way, or to see it primarily in one way. I think Bill Hewlett and HP was more unique than you might first realize. But I think they really understood the profound excitement of inventing the future, and the kind of research mind, the research exploration was required to do that. The openness of their laboratories and so on was phenomenal. Now HP lost that, unfortunately, but so I think that in some ways we have been so focused on what Wall Street wants that we're willing to kill an awful lot of other things. I mean, it used to be, let me cough a moment. It used to be that we thought about stakeholder value. Today we think about shareholder value. There's a huge difference between those two. Hewlett-Packard thought about stakeholder value. Now, as an employee, they were being considered, and what makes their environment constantly provocative, learning, and so on and so forth.
Well, and they thought about engineering the kind of, and they were engineers. They said, you know what? We need to think about engineering the kind of culture we're going to have. And of course, they created the HP way.
Yes, and that's what I mean. The HP way was phenomenal. Okay. So there was deep thinking about that as a social entity. Okay. Now we use social theory to figure out how to extract more value, quite honestly. And I think there's quite a difference. I mean, the Bill Gates story is complicated. I actually think Microsoft in the early days wasn't much better than some of the things you see in Facebook. But I think that Bill has had time to pull back and to look at the whole world. And Bill has had a lot of opportunity to get out of his own comfort zone and look at things afresh. And I just think that has had a tremendous impact on him as he now opens his own aperture in terms of what things to pay attention to and to understand what are the forces that are entangled with other forces that you have to look at. And quite honestly, and we may come to this at the very end of our conversation as well, we may be coming, we grew up in the age of enlightenment, where things were nicely packaged up. Economics could build nice linear models, and then things that fell outside of that were just called externalities. And you hoped that those externalities didn't dominate the world, which of course they did. But I think we have now moving to what you might call the age of entanglement rather than the age of enlightenment. Enlightenment had these objects and causality or simple evolution, etc. The age of entanglement, you begin to realize just how entangled everything is with everything else. And then how do you start to pull apart those entanglements? How do you play with those entanglements to get a feeling for what they really mean now? Also recognize that they may evolve, because after all, those are the basis of wicked problems, which most of our problems are today, which they themselves evolve as we approach solving them, and so on. So, I mean, I think that we've moved from a kind of a static, relatively static view of the world with, well understood causalities or well understood Darwinian processes, to a world now which is really driven by complexity science. And I think that world requires new ways to look at problems, new approaches, and so on. And I think that I think you will see that, you know, it's fascinating for me to see Bill Gates, you know, 5 years ago, having been able to call this game that we just went through, the COVID. Okay, that didn't come from looking at a goddamn Microsoft operating system. You know, that came from being in the world, understanding the problems, understanding, attempting to solve them, but understanding how things cross combined with everything else at different time scales that led to certain types of terrible health problems and so on and so forth. So I mean, I think that this shift from the age of enlightenment to the age of entanglement is really profound. And I think, you know, if you look at Zuckerberg, you know, before Congress, you see that, you know, the idea of the entanglements that are involved in even what he's trying to say, you know, are kind of, wow, I don't have a clean answer here, do I? Yeah, and I think that that's the, you know, one of the beautiful things about Wikipedia, by the way, is they help you to see the entanglements. You know, they don't give just simple explanations. They actually wind this up and show you how this relates to this and how this evolved out of that and so on and so forth. That's the world we're in today.
And that's, I mean, I think Wikipedia is a great example of what we'd hoped. Remember user-generated content and social media, and we saw Wikipedia and we went, hallelujah, look at this. This is magical. This is good. This is tech for good. But I mentioned before that you have had a front row seat in Silicon Valley over the years, and Silicon Valley, of course, to significant extent, was born out of the Second World War, which unleashed, you know, sort of an unprecedented era of innovation and peacetime that's followed since. And now we're in the midst of this yet another global crisis in a completely different world, in a world of entanglement. What kind of impact do you think this pandemic is going to have on innovation in the years and decades to come?
Well, first of all, there is the pandemic issue. There's also climate change issue. That, you know, and if you really look at, you know, in this country, you know, even the last 20 years, the number of major crises that we have actually had, starting with, you know, 9/11, and then financial crisis of 2008, you know, and then this, and there's another one in between there I don't need to go into. But I mean, you know, so in some sense, we're now jumping from crisis to crisis to crisis. And I think that we have to start realizing that there's a certain sense of resilience that's called for. And I want to argue that the resilience is a kind of resilience that transcends the resilience of technology. As engineers, we have one sense of resilience. And the question is, how does the system snap back? But if you look at how ecologies work, the resilience in ecologies is, in fact, when the ecology snaps back, it's often richer. It itself has evolved in very deep ways, at multiple timescales. If you have to look in the ecology as a complex adaptive system at multiple levels, at multiple timescales, et cetera, you see suddenly how this whole system has been working together, and it got jolted, and then it had to do learnings at multiple levels to respond. So when it came back, it was stronger. So we have to start, I think, appreciating more how nature itself works. And it's not just a set of objects with simple causality between them. Rather, it's, you know, incredible complex sets of exchanges. They have amazingly complex feedbacks that are actually operating at multiple levels. and have design for emergence in there, and so on. And so I think that what we're now operating on is a different space. Now, to go back to the technology game, I think it's really interesting because I felt in the late 70s and 80s, everybody recognized it was a fundamentally new game. And we were encouraged to actually, in some sense, build the tools that we needed to explore the things we wanted, to make the things we dreamed about, as long as we actually made them and used them. And I remember being called in by the head of Xerox PARC, George Pake, a physicist. And he said, John, if you don't know how to measure that, build a tool, and then build that, but use it, to build something and use that. And there was a sense to build and use to explore, the game, so to speak. We did have to not worry about quarterly returns as the dominant factor. Now, we moved through them for the next 20 or 30 years, things became more stable. You could understand how there were a whole new set of value systems that came to be. I found the idea of running Xerox PARC, not that interesting in many ways because the world was kind of too predictable. Then it's ironic that in the last 3 years or so, partially with deep learning, partially with quantum computing, the new set of tools that we have, there's a certain sense, oh my God, where is the radical exploration that defined us in the 70s and 80s? And so I think there's an increasing need for radical experimentation, but that can often be done, in kind of the environments you now yourself are building. How do you get small groups that are kind of collectively working together? I mean, it's very interesting. When I first moved out here, I came from Route 128 in Boston. I was at BBN right there in Fresh Pond. And there was this really good historian in Berkeley that was interested in writing studying the difference between Silicon Valley and Route 128. Okay. And I laughed, as she wanted to talk to me. I said, it's so simple. And she said, what? How can it be so simple? And I said, you don't get it. Out here, all these competitive quote unquote firms, guess what? At nighttime, we drink together. We go to the same bars. We go to the same restaurants, and yeah, we don't bring lawyers, and we're excited and we swap ideas, and so on and so forth. There's a tremendous, rich, informal learning. Today we call these things not communities of practice, but networks of practice, technically speaking. In Route 128, two competitive companies would eat in different restaurants. Honest. Okay, partially because they were spread out as well, and so on and so forth. But there was, a profound informal swapping of ideas and aspirations, that defined how we moved ahead and how we stimulated each other to be more clever than each other, but to be viewed as the excitement of being at the edge of discovering new stuff, building new stuff. We have a chance to bring that back now, but it is as social as much as technical. And I think part of the things that you're up to yourself right now in the True North is also to pay more attention to that social, and how that operates across multiple spectrums at the same time. because in today's world, by the way, radical innovation is happening as much in finance as in technology, or radical ways to organize in this whitewater world that we're in today. And so in some ways, we can't just lift paradigms of the past into the current. And one of the things we learned from COVID is wake up, guys, this is a new game. And I call it a game in the sense, not to show disrespect, but in the sense of saying, like, we got to play with this in understanding, how do you probe it? How do you listen to it in new ways? How do you learn from it? How do you collectively learn from it, and so on? And so in this sense, it's very active. And I think that, one has to use tools to do this, a new set of tools, but also a new mindset. And as they call it, a new type of social platform as well, going back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this interview. And so I think that we're in a need, we're entering a world, and I think that is really qualitatively different. And one of the reasons I'm so encouraged is not by COVID. We will get through that, although understanding how viruses really work is damn hard in many ways, although they're trivial devices at some level, compared with living organisms, no matter how small. But there's a certain sense also that, I'm struck by how we think of living on the world, not in the world. How we're kind of oblivious to how, our trees are in some sense communicating with each other. And how this vast ecology, interlocking ecologies are actually working. And how in many ways our gut biome is 100,000 times more complicated than our DNA chromosome, and yet so much of who we are being determined by that. And so I think that we're on the verge of quite a new set of explorations that require a new mindset and our ability to kind of open our eyes, but understand this is a fundamentally cross-disciplinary game. That, technical, humanistic, and artistic, all wrapped together. And the siloed approach, where you just dig deeper and deeper in this pit, has some value, but it has to be complemented by something else.
John, I think it gives me great hope. You talk a lot about listen to the world and live in the world, and you've got a real focus on the need for us to pay attention to people, human beings. I wonder about, and I'm hopeful that COVID we're going to be able to extract the good, capture the good that's come out of COVID. And help us make those fundamental changes that we need. I mean, there are some people who believe, and that there's a narrative around, this was sent to us to basically jar us out of the path we've been on and force us to focus on areas such as, the way that we treat each other, our environment, violence, a whole host of sick institutions that we've got that absolutely need, a shake. And in fact, more than a shake, they need to be considered in fundamentally new ways. The one thing that I have seen emerge out of this so far is it seems that we've been able to evolve very quickly to the point where, we can have intimacy without proximity. And I think about the implications for that and things like how people structure and run their businesses, how we educate, where we educate. And I do think that it's got a tremendous opportunity for us to, reach communities and people and have participation of people in a far more, in a fundamental way that we couldn't in the past. I mean, we're still going to need to make sure that the other thing I think that we've discovered is that, the internet, broadband is infrastructure of national importance and national interest, and we better quickly figure out how to make sure that we have ubiquitous broadband and access across the countries so everyone can participate. Do you see other kind of early signs coming out of this as to shifts that are going to have a profound impact on all aspects of our life?
Oh, I think, first of all, as you said, it's a fantastic wake-up call to, again, open our aperture to understand more, to also understand, different types of social protocol that enable even, remote communication to work much more effectively. But let's take, a bunch of the companies in your own area. Think about DevOps, or agile teams. What I am stunned by is to see a 12 or 14 person agile team be so effective working in different states. The team is completely distributed. And yet they've developed a set of protocols. How do you do stand-up reviews, for example, that enable us to be I understand each other in some ways better than if you were sitting at the desk next to me, but you weren't forced to do a stand-up review. And by the way, how to do a stand-up review, and what do you render, and so on and so forth. There's something that in the startup world, we have discovered by trial and error that now may also generalize in incredibly powerful ways. Or if you look at that bookstore company called Amazon, how they have multiple thousand two pizza teams working, the sense of agency inside each one of those teams, and yet what enables them to communicate with each other? Well, there's interesting new social protocols that are used. And how do you do API calls? What's an API gateway do for you? All these things that we're beginning to invent new technologies to make all that possible. And so I think that we now have to pay much more attention to how do we work intimately, but distributedly, more generally. And that lets us also be able to do work living in the kind of space we want, that want to ski, that want to mountain climb, that want to surf, that want to motorcycle, all these things. And so there's a chance to be able to say, no, we are living at the same time we are creating, and how to blend those together in new ways, but being willing to invent new ways to work and the right kinds of technical affordances and social protocols around them.
The notion of protocol is an interesting one because it really is, whether it's, we're on this journey of developing and deploying protocols around so many different aspects of our lives, whether it's, healthcare, personal protective equipment protocols, around how we work. But the word that I think is really interesting that you used in there is this notion of intimacy without proximity, and I think we see it because we're in many cases, when people come to work, they leave their face in a jar by the door. And now, of course, we're meeting people's kids and their dogs and their parents, and we're seeing, the bottle of scotch over your shoulder, and we have a portal now into people's real lives to see who they really are. And so it's interesting in the fact that in the absence of proximity, all of a sudden our relationships have gone another level deeper.
Absolutely, but I think the irony to me, and I'm biased on this, is we're also beginning to explore more, and we have been, in how this technology provides incredibly interesting, lightweight but deep connections with each other. I'm stunned. I picked this up more in Asia originally, Japan originally, and then in other parts of Asia than here. How do we use texting to, have a 20-second message that actually connects me to what that person is now doing in an interesting way. Not to use it to just blah, 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 but there's a sense of staying connected in terms of, small things, but small things that are meaningful, not just to show off, not just to take one more snapshot of me eating this beautiful lobster, but if you really look at some of the more interesting uses of these technologies, I'm stunned with the sense of distributed intimacy that they enable. Even Slack helps you operate differently. It shouldn't surprise you, but in our book Design Unbound, we have a very major chapter and a little book out called Networks of Intimacy that really go into kind of what are the paradoxes we're living in this world in terms of the global versus the intimate. And I think that, it's surprising to people that they don't really think about, how a mother and a daughter who's run off to college or, working the other part of the world, actually keep each other in each other's space, the mental space, and I think that, there's something wonderful about that if done authentically. And so I think that, I think we're on the verge of, and maybe because of the COVID, taking some of this more seriously in terms of how to extend a different kind of intimacy in a distributed space.
So John, I'm thrilled to hear, of course, that you're involved in doing some work with Indigenous people in Northern Canada, and thank you for that. Maybe you could take a moment and just talk a bit about what you're doing and what we can learn from it in our True North.
Right. Let me focus on the learning part because, it turned out to be the breakthrough in working with the First Nations was not that we were bringing expertise, but rather an authentic desire to learn. And so, so both Anne, my colleague, and I, Anne is more the dominant player here, and Pendleton Julian, is kind of the recognition of being able to take seriously how do they look at the world, how do they live and create histories for themselves, and so on. And so we saw it as an incredible opportunity for us to learn, not to bring wisdom from the South to the North. And I think that, and partially even talking with the 13, 14-year-olds up there, an understanding of how they take this kind of environmentalism so incredibly seriously, and how they take the fact that, how do you have a conversation with the earth? Which, at first I heard this, I said, what? I stand on the earth. I said, no. Unfortunately, I used to do farming as a kid, so I was much more aware that actually the earth is alive, and heaven help you if you don't pay some attention to that. But that does not occur in our vocabulary down here. And so, so listening to these kids, but also listening to how these kids were telling me stories that were from their family 1,000 years ago, that were driving how they looked at the world today and the sincerity that they had about the importance of the earth. It was just stunning to me. And I just think that, approaching it as an opportunity for us to learn with and from them, I think is an amazing opportunity. That's what's driving us at the moment.
We started out talking about the history of the Valley and of course your work at Park and how we truly romanticized technology and then we talked about some of the dark forces, and of course now we end with how tech can be for good and how it really can change our lives and deepen our lives in ways which wouldn't ever have been available otherwise. So I wanted to just take the opportunity to say thank you for joining us here today. It's your humanity and your commitment to tech for good you definitely, it's central to who you are and I believe who you always have been. And I just applaud the contribution that you've made. Thank you very much for your commitment to Canada. And one day we will hopefully have an opportunity to have some proximity in our relationship. Thanks again, John.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all very much for joining us here today on True North TV, and we'll be back to you next Tuesday at noon. Thanks again.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. Subscribe to Communitech's YouTube channel to get notified of future episodes of True North TV.